Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is literally the guy who wrote the book on compliance, the Compliance Handbook, 4th edition, which was published by LexisNexis in 2023. He has authored 25 other books on business leadership, compliance and ethics, and corporate governance, including international bestsellers and an award-winning series, Fox on Compliance. He leads the social media discussion on compliance with his award-winning blog and is the voice of compliance, having founded the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Tom Fox.
Well, thanks very much.
Tom, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Fear. Just fear. Afraid I wasn't good enough. Afraid it wouldn't be good enough. Just fear. When my daughter was 7, she wrote her first book. And I asked her, how did you do that, honey? She said, Dad, it's easy. You just sit down and write. That's all it took.
Well, that's a great attitude and a good lesson from a 7-year-old for all of us. We use the word compliance a lot when describing your career. Tell us more about your background and how this subject of compliance became the focus of your career.
I'm a lawyer by professional training. In my last corporate position, I was a general counsel at a company that had violated a major U.S. compliance law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. From that experience as a general counsel, I learned about corporate compliance. I later went out on my own to practice law and decided what I really enjoyed about that experience was the design, creation, and implementation of compliance programs inside of a corporation. It was 2010. There were very few lawyers in private practice who did that. So I decided to specialize in the nuts and bolts of compliance.
So this just basically means an adherence to rules and policies in the workplace. Is that correct?
Well, it's setting up policies and procedures to comply with a law or regulatory scheme. And that's it. So you write policies and procedures, you train on them, you monitor the results of the policies and procedures to make sure everything's running smoothly. You update as appropriate. You have your top management or leadership say the right things, that they are interested in doing business ethically and in compliance. And there's some major risks that are well known that you have to spend a little bit more time on. So you monitor those risks as well.
So who is the audience for your books? Is it the managers in corporations?
So I have 3 general types of audience members. One is corporate compliance officers. The second is other corporate executives, chief financial officers, CEOs, chief technology officers, heads of HR, internal audit, et cetera. And then legal types, both those in private practice and those inside of corporations who may work on these issues.
Are you still practicing law, or are you full-time writing now?
Well, I don't say it very often, and I certainly don't say it very loudly, but yes, I do.
Well, you also host a podcast for Texas Hill Country authors. How did you get involved with that aspect of promotion?
So I moved to the Hill Country a little over 2 years ago. And when I moved here, there weren't any podcasts. I'd already founded one podcast network, the Compliance Podcast Network. And so I started with the Hill Country podcast, telling the stories of the people, places, and things which make this the best place in Texas to live, in my opinion. I had so many authors on that podcast that I spun out a separate Hill Country Authors podcast. And I had so many artists that I've actually spun out a Hill Country Artist podcast. And I ended up founding another podcast network called the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network to see if we can bring podcasts and social media marketing to the area of the Hill Country and really as a model for rural podcast networks.
That's so intriguing to me. I don't know how you have time to do anything else, because when I started this podcast, I thought, well, I'll do 10 or 12 episodes. You know, they say that you have a podcast fade, usually about half the podcasts in the country fade after about 10 episodes. So I thought, well, I'll just pay it forward to my writing community, and then I'll go on and finish my other projects. Well, I'm recording my 182nd episode with you in just a little over a year, and it shows no sign of fading. So I don't know how you have time to do anything else.
So a podcast, I blog every day. Still practice law, but don't say that to anyone. And really have a good time doing all three.
Well, that's great. When you write a book on compliance, is it like any other nonfiction book? How do you proceed? Do you search for an agent, decide to use a hybrid, a small press? Do you have to self-publish?
Well, I've never written anything outside of compliance, so I don't know the answer to the first part of that question, if it's different than any other area, but I've done all of them. I have used publishers who, of course, have gone bankrupt. I have self-published. And now with this book, the Compliance Handbook, 4th edition, I'm pleased to be with LexisNexis, who is the top legal publisher in the United States, and they wanted to create a compliance wing. So they asked me to write a book, and it turned out I was about 3/4 away through the Compliance Handbook, and I said, I'll have a draft ready in 2 months. And they said, wonderful. So it all sort of worked out.
You are quite prolific.
If you write every day, you can be prolific. So that's what I try to do.
Do you have a challenging part of your writing routine? It sounds like you write pretty quickly.
The most challenging part now is I've got so much going on with podcasting and the other things that I really have to force myself to sit down and write and stay abreast of current events with an eye towards the next edition of the Compliance Handbook.
Well, I know writing rules and regulations and setting up all of those systems is different than writing a novel, but you still have to keep your readers' interest. How do you maintain doing that so that lay people can understand what they're supposed to implement?
Well, I have to say it's not different than writing a work of fiction, because the one key element is to write. Write. Or as I say, get off your tail and write. So if you write, WRITE, you can create a book in really any area. So I'm a firm believer that it's writing that makes the difference. What I try to do is give practical advice in non-legal terms that anyone in the corporate world can understand and utilize, focused on one thing a day you can do with 3 key takeaways that are little or no cost. So I established that format several years ago, and it seems to resonate with my audience because of that. It's not going to be legalistic. It's not going to be formalistic. It's not going to be written in a way that's highly technical. Any person can sit down and read my book and implement the suggestions I have.
Well, that's great because when I worked in the corporate world, we all needed handbooks and how-to books and how to keep us on track. And so I'm happy to know that yours are very readable and very doable.
That's exactly what I strive for.
Well, what is your writing routine? If you have all the podcasts going, do you have a set routine? Are you a morning person or a night person? You said you write every day.
So I'm definitely a morning person. And I try to write before lunch at some point. I'm a crack of dawn guy, so I get up at the crack of dawn and start working. And when I can get something done in the morning, it's generally much fresher, better. But there are times when it's the afternoon. I'm not too much of a night writer anymore. But the key is just to write every day. And I've tried to set aside 1 hour a day, and that just never works. But when I started blogging every day, because when I started my blog in 2010, it was 3 days a week. But when I moved to every day, it actually became easier because I made that commitment. And in my mind, it was just a part of my workday. So I would set aside an hour to write on some topic. And that's what's been the most effective for me, is just to write every day.
I certainly think that prevents us from having writer's block, if there is such a thing. If you do write every day, then you just get into that routine.
That's certainly been my experience.
What about more about your publishing journey? Because you've experienced all of the options, it sounds like. Tell us more about which worked for you, which didn't, and why, and what the difference is now with your LexisNexis.
So I did learn, go with an established publisher. Don't go with a new one, because the new one, that's the one that went bankrupt. And it just took forever to get anything done. And so I went off on a long journey of self-publishing. And then there were some publishers in the compliance space that had me write books. But LexisNexis is a truly professional publishing house. It's been a wonderful experience to work with them. I'm on my fourth edition now, so I understand what they want in terms of not simply content, but structure. I know when I can get a book draft to them, and the process going forward, and when it will be delivered to me in final form. They pay very well. It's a 55% royalty, so you can't complain about that. And I've developed good relationships with editors. So as a writer, I had not fully appreciated how much an editor can bring to the process, and that they really have your book's interest at heart even more than you. So they will frankly tell you when something needs to be deleted, added, or changed. And I've come to realize that's their profession. And so I listen to what they say, and I think certainly made me a better writer, and it's made my books better as well. So if you have the chance to go with a professional publishing house, my experience has been positive.
I think that's encouraging for all of our listeners to hear that you tried different avenues and you kept trying other ones after those didn't work, and you finally landed on a really great situation. I think that has to encourage all of us, because a lot of people will try self-publishing or try an indie press, and if it doesn't work for them, then they give up.
Well, and I've, as you know, interviewed lots of authors, and multiple authors have had good success in the self-publishing realm, and it works for them. And I guess to maybe follow up on your point is find out what works for you. If I had published a different type of book, I've actually published 3 since this book came out. And one was self-published, and one was a children's book, which had a children's book publisher. So I've had experiences with all, and they've all worked for me.
Well, we writers like to write. We don't like to promote ourselves very well. Have you found any publicity that works or that doesn't work? Do you have to promote your own books, or does your publisher do that for you?
They don't do a lot of that. They do some. The first edition of the Compliance Handbook, I had a huge budget, I went on every show I could. I bought television. I bought everything. And I don't want to say it was useless, but I learned a lesson that, at least in the realm of a sort of a technically focused compliance book, focus on your audience, which is the compliance community, and talk to people in whatever channels will get to them. So a compliance podcast, a compliance blog, lots of compliance focused product companies have some sort of social media outreach, and they're happy to host me. And that's really the lesson I've learned. The first time I did it, I spent way too much money and I never recouped it. So I just released the book and talk about it. I don't travel and do road shows or book tours just because you have to go where the compliance community is, and that's usually workshops or conferences.
Well, a book like this certainly becomes your calling card. After you speak at a conference, then they certainly want to buy your book because that is your audience. I wonder if this is a book that could be a textbook in a law school.
The short answer is yes. And I know that because I taught a law school class this summer where it was the textbook. So it has been used in that manner, and it's been sent to various law libraries across the country as well.
Well, even the big five are requiring their authors to do most of their own publicity. So that's been quite a burden on a lot of our writers, is to take over that aspect of marketing their own books.
I watched a video series by James Patterson and another one by David Baldacci, and they both said the same thing. And they both talked about how they marketed. And obviously, it's a very different audience than mine, but their thoughts were absolutely spot on. Is talk to your audience, whoever that may be. And if you're going to do something different, you can, but you have to communicate that to your audience. So for at least my compliance work, my audience are generally in-house types and compliance professionals. So those are the people that I talk to.
Are there any specific books or seminars or writing retreats or groups that you can share that have improved your writing journey, and maybe even some of those authors that you interview?
Well, the great thing about podcasting is I get more out of it than anyone. And every time I interview someone, I learn from them. And that's why I think it's the greatest job in the world to be a podcast host, because I get to talk to the best and the brightest and those who want to talk. So I learn as much doing exactly what you and I are doing and what I did with you as I do really in any other format. But let me go back to the basics. Just right. Just right. And whether it's nonfiction, whether it's fiction, whatever it may be, if you just sit down and start writing, that's the key, or at least it was for me.
Would you encourage any of our authors to write a blog or to start a podcast?
Absolutely. If you're starting a blog, you're writing. And just the discipline of writing at a prescribed interval, whether it's once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, or 5 times a week, like I do, is useful. It forces you to keep up with current developments. I hope it's obvious how much I love podcasting and how much I have gotten out of it, and that the opportunities in podcasting are equally as great.
How would you recommend that someone go about becoming a podcaster?
Well, once again, the answer is very simple. You get off your tail and you do it. It's that simple. I'm a Mac guy, computer wise. There is editing software built into the Mac. You can record from a cell phone. You can record from your computer. There's no bar to entry. Probably the biggest expense, which is the most important, and I see you're using it, is having a quality microphone. We both have Shure mics. So it's really The barrier to entry is extraordinarily low. You could probably start a podcast for $50 if you were so inclined. You could certainly spend more, but just do it. There's plenty of podcast resources out there. If anybody's listening, wants to know how to start a podcast, I wrote an ebook on it. Happy to share that with anyone, but just do it. People call me a lot and seek advice on how to start. I'm like, start. Get off your tail and start.
So you do your own editing, all your sound editing?
I do.
It's very time consuming. I don't know how you do it all.
That's why I get up at the crack of dawn every day.
Tom, tell us a little bit about the passage you've brought to share today, and then read from it so that we can hear your voice.
So the passage I brought is actually the dedication. And the reason I wanted to read the dedication is I had the privilege to go to undergrad at the University of Texas, graduate school at Michigan State University, and law school at the University of Michigan. And there were, in each one of those universities, there were 3 professors who stood out and really gave me skills that I certainly didn't realize at the time, but I've used the rest of my life. And I'd always wanted to have a forum where I could say thank you publicly. And each one of them, they're between, I think, 85 and 95, but they're all still alive. So I wrote the dedication, and I was able to track them all down and send them a copy of the book. And the one from the University of Texas, I literally had not seen him since 1978, and I'm sure he has no memory of me. And he emailed me this lovely note that said how much it meant to him, because he had no idea what he means to people or what he taught or any of those. And to get a dedication from someone 40 years later meant as much to him as anything. So I wanted to read the dedication if I could. This book is dedicated to the 3 professors who were the most impactful to me in my academic career and helped form me into the legal and compliance professional I am today. First, Dr. George Forgy, Associate Professor Emeritus, Distinguished Teaching Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Texas, from whom I reinforced my love of all things U.S. history with an academic rigor to ask questions and follow up. Next, Dr. Richard Block, Professor Emeritus from Michigan State University, School of Human Resources and Labor Relations, who taught me how to believe in myself and to analyze business and economic issues from an academic perspective. Finally, from the James E. and Sarah A. Deegan Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of Michigan, Professor Theodore St. Antoine, who introduced me into a lifelong love of the study of law and how one can work in and use law to move society forward.
That is just so meaningful and so touching to me, because I was a teacher. I was an instructor from kindergarten all the way to the university level. And, you know, for you 40 years later to recognize these professors, I just think that is so wonderful.
Like I said, it's something I wanted to do for a long time, and I never felt like other than maybe sending them a letter, which would have been as impactful. There wasn't a way I could do it publicly, and I had the opportunity to do so in this book.
I know they were just so touched by that, because not many instructors and professors have people come back and even thank them, much less dedicate a book to them. I know your books are very heavy in compliance and rules and regulations. Do you have to complete a lot of research as you go along or in the beginning?
This area of law, in terms of legal cases and laws to read, is actually very small. There's one law that's maybe 8 or 10 pages. And then there's actually only about 10 cases over the past 40 years interpreting this law. So one of the reasons I chose it, it was an area that I knew I could teach myself. So being a good lawyer, I feel like I'm a lawyer. I can read it and figure it out as much as the next person. So that's what I did. And then I just kept abreast of current events and the commentary. And because of my blogging and now podcasting, that's what I do full time. So the research I do is actually daily on an ongoing basis every time I interview someone. Or there was an enforcement action last week, and I blogged about it today. And I can guarantee you it will be a part of the fifth edition going forward. So it's an ongoing process that I've never stopped. I'm a lifelong learner. I'm incredibly curious. I like learning about everything I can get my hands on. So for me, it's not work, it's just fun.
So this is more of a small specialty, a small niche among attorneys?
A very small niche.
Well, that's where you want to be.
It's called International Anti-Corruption Compliance outside the United States.
Oh. Do you have any other books in you?
Well, that book of fiction is still in there somewhere. And once again, how do you do fiction? You sit down and write, and that's what I haven't done. So that's my goal, to write a book or a series. I love mysteries. I love murder mysteries. I love thrillers. And that's my goal, is to write a book that could turn into a series of some character that is percolating inside me.
Well, you have a wealth of material to draw from in the corporate world. You could probably write a mystery about some of the cases that you've been involved with.
That's exactly my plan to do. And I've even done podcast series on those cases to make myself think about how I would structure them. And the crazy thing about this world is, if I told you some of the stories, you would look at me and said, nobody did that. That's fiction. You made that up. And they really are. The stories are stranger than fiction. Or
they
as
really
one friend, I guess a writer said that, you can't write that because it's too insane. No one would believe it.
I interviewed an attorney who's an international attorney living in Japan, and that's exactly how he came up with the premise for his book, were some of the craziest cases you've ever heard of in international law.
Absolutely. And they all happen. This law applies only outside the U.S., so almost everything happens outside the U.S. So you've got crazy international travel as well.
What does writing success look like to you personally?
Writing success to me is a printed book. When I see that printed book, probably when I send the manuscript in is enough. But every time I see a book, that's success to me.
I do love to hold a book in my hand, open that box when they come in, and to see an actual book. That's our legacy that we leave to the world.
It's like my daughter said when she was 7, Dad, just sit down and do it.
Tom, is there anything that readers don't know about you? I commented earlier before the podcast on that magnificent collection of items you've got behind there. Is there anything that we wouldn't know, any hobbies that you have, or anything that you love to do outside this realm?
I'm going to actually just say, if you want to write and you're over 50, guess what? You have a life's worth of experiences, and your writing will be better than it would have been at 25. And you can still experience the joy that you and I have. One of my podcasts was a Kerrville author who I knew he was older. And at the end, I asked him how old he was. And he was 93. It was his 7th book. His first book was at age 75. So just, if that's what you want to do, just sit down and do it. And when you're over 50, or in my case, over 60, it's even more fun.
That's certainly been the case for me. I think we have so much hindsight and so much wisdom that we couldn't have written a lot of these books at age 30. So I appreciate you so much being with us today and talking about what might be a dry subject to some, but so needed by so many. So thank you very much. And we can now count you among our authors over 50.
Well, Julia, it's been my pleasure, and thank you for doing this podcast. It's been a ton of fun.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's D-A-I-L-Y, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.